As we start looking at the archaeology of a psyche of an individual and how that relates to the whole, one can think of, for example, my grandfather. Now, my grandfather had won the lottery, and he went bankrupt trying to build a beautiful garden. So he took all the lottery money and tried to make this wonderful garden, and he never finished it, but was instead sent overseas and drove a tank through some of the more beautiful gardens in Europe. And so rather than living in a garden, he's actually damaging gardens in Europe. And while he was in Europe, a tank shell disabled his tank and splintered into his knee. And he's in extraordinary pain in a foreign country, trampling over some of the most beautiful countryside that, as a naturally beauty-oriented person, he would want to protect and create rather than destroy. And he's stuck in terror and in pain and in trauma, meaning his life is in jeopardy. And the trauma moves towards PTSD, in the violation, in the violence, in the terror without repair that comes from being trapped in a small space, in a helpless space, with a tank shell, one exploding in your knee so you can't move, and just waiting there like a sitting duck. Now, like the British Army in World War I, the American military complex systematically avoided dealing with the reality of PTSD, the reality of terror, of helplessness, and of trauma that has plagued returning veterans for thousands of years. The Greeks dealt with it with the Greek tragedies. Britain probably did the most to shame its warriors returning home, and went so far as to ban the word shell shock, which was one of the euphemisms for PTSD and trauma. And so he's returned with no conversation about what's going on. And if you think about that, what does it take for a cult or a culture to pretend that the reptilian brain doesn't exist, to pretend that PTSD doesn't exist, to not ask the men, how are they feeling? To not ask the men, what do they need, not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically? To not do a census study to see what's the impact on these men in American families. And you realize these are obvious questions for a human being to ask. How does it feel? How have you changed? How's it affecting your family? How's it affecting your children? These questions are free to ask, but they are not asked. A census could go out and report on these things, but the census doesn't go out. There's a willful ignorance. And we could protest that as a people. Let's learn the truth about our men returning from war. But we didn't. And so in order for my grandfather to be given PTSD, number one, to be uneducated about PTSD, because he was given something he didn't have a name for. He was given something he didn't know how to respond to. What does it take to give someone something that devastating in terms of the shift of identity? Because PTSD traumatizes. Well, PTSD shatters the old identity before the trauma. And so to give someone something that changes who you are, your sense of self, but not give them a single book, a single study, not ask them a single question about how they feel and how they're changing, and then for no one else to ask, and for them to get the message, this is a shameful topic. We are not going to ask, and we don't want you to talk about it. And what does it take for an entire cult to say that to be a man is to be someone without feelings, and then instill their men in absolute terror? It sounds pretty sociopathic, but it also sounds pretty unanimous, meaning the children in school are not taught to ask their father, Dad, do you have PTSD? What went on in the war? How were you before this happened? So the children are psychologically illiterate. The teachers are not taught to ask the kids. Now, everyone knows there's a problem. It's impossible to ignore the increase in family violence, the increase in addiction, the alcohol and drug consumption, the increase of terror and helplessness. Anyone can deduce that this is likely if they have any degree of psychological literacy, because the psyche and its evolution and development follow similar scientific principles to the development of sandstone or shale or the creation of oxygen. It's not some vague mystery. The only reason that it feels like a vague mystery to many of us is that we systematically avoid a single formal hour of psychological literacy in school, available for parents. You can go cradle to grave in our cult, be born, be raised by your parents, go to school, go to college, get a job, retire from that job, have children, and die without a single formal hour of scientifically based relational literacy, emotional literacy, psychological literacy, traumatic literacy, or cultural literacy, meaning when you just learn that this is why we do things in this cult for this reason and because we've always done them and that's why they're the right thing, and we don't learn about other cults. We don't study why the French think they're the right cult, why the South Africans think they're the right cult, why every cult thinks that it's the right cult. And we don't study the relative sustainable human well-being per unit of energy consumed in each cult. We don't say, per 1,000 people, the French have this number of homeless people, the Germans have this number of homeless people, the Danish have this number of homeless people. Per 1,000 people, this country has this amount of hunger. We have this amount. This country is better than us. This country is worse than us. This cult leads to a different direction than ours and a different result. We don't learn cultural literacy. And so one of the consequences for that is that neither my grandfather nor a single human being associated with him, including his children, have the language to address trauma and PTSD upon his return from World War II. Now, when you have a husband with PTSD who can't talk about it, it's painful. So my grandmother on my father's side increases her alcohol addiction and alcoholism. Now, what does this mean for the marriage? It means that she's not as available to my grandfather. It means that my grandfather is not as available to her. But where does she go to in America? Where does my grandmother go to in America to learn how to grieve the loss of her husband? A human being left and a reptile returned. Someone who was rational and empathic went to war, and someone who was paranoid and sociopathic returned. Meaning his consciousness was primarily in his rational and empathic brain. And when he returned, his consciousness was primarily in his reptilian and rational brain. And with the alcoholism, her empathy shrinks, and her reptilian, her fight, flight, freeze increases. Her reptilian brain increases. Now, what is the impact on a child, a 6-year-old child, who has two emotionally traumatized parents? For parents, two emotionally unavailable and traumatized parents. One with noticeable PTSD. What is the impact on a child? And what is the message to the child when not a single peer, a single teacher, a single parent, a single government official checks in on that child to protect the child from the terror of that trauma, of that PTSD? Because children of veterans with PTSD are hit more. They're treated more violently. The violence is not repaired as much. There's less empathy. There's more cruelty. What does it do to a 6-year-old boy to be raised by someone who is capable of inducing severe trauma but not capable of repairing that trauma? And what does it do when that boy turns to a mother who is crippled by alcoholism and is unable to repair the damage? What does it do to grow up and feel that the universe is an unsafe and a scary place because both the giants that say they're there to protect you do not protect you and are a cause of much of the severest traumatic pain that you experience? And who's intervening in government, in school, to protect my father from two traumatized parents stuck in their reptilian brain? Who intervenes when my father's 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old? Who intervenes when my father's 20 years old and is emotionally stunted as a way of blunting the fear and the pain of a sociopathic father? Who teaches my father about trauma, about PTSD? Who helps my father understand that the alcoholism of his mother isn't personal? It doesn't mean he's a bad kid. who interrupts the cycle of abuse? And the answer in our cult is no one, zero. No, not a single teacher, not a single sibling, not a single peer, not a single parent, not a single parents of friends, not a single government official, not a single employer or employee pulls dad aside and says, you know, your dad has PTSD from the war. This is what PTSD is. This is what he needs. And here's why not a single human being in the United States is going to give it to him. It's not your fault. What I'm painting here is an ecology, a cultural ecology of cruelty to both grown-ups and children alike, of willful ignorance in all feminine areas. The science of relationships, the science of emotions, the science of psychology, the science of trauma and PTSD and its repair, and cultural awareness, the science of the cult-like nature of cultures, and how to understand how healthy and or dangerous a given cult is. These are ecological and feminine domains. No one, for that matter, in my father's generation taught him anything about ecology, about the interconnectedness of the planet and the species. So, in a chauvinistic cult, where that which is masculine, making money, getting things done, tending the outer world, is elevated, and that which is feminine, what we are aware of, the science of the psyche, the self, is denied, shamed, suppressed. It is not even acknowledged that this is a violation, a tragedy, a pattern of abuse. So we not only don't learn anything useful in these domains, we don't learn that we're not learning about these areas because we're chauvinists as opposed to scientists. Because if you ask a scientist, what areas of study and science are most relevant for a human being to meet its ultimate drive and goal, which is to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse? Well, a scientist would look at the data and say, well, human relationships determines happiness more than your income. Communication skills about feelings, etc., determine well-being more than mathematical skills. You would learn that a healthy sexuality is an essential part of the fullness and vitality of life, another thing systematically ignored. You would learn that trauma is one of the greatest sources of human suffering. And so it makes incredible scientific sense as a cult to study those things that cause the most chronic suffering and preclude or lead to the most amount of sustainable human well-being. And so a scientist would say it is unscientific to study algebra before studying parenting, because a parent will determine the well-being of a culture by raising a generation as a fractal pattern of all parents more than whether or not you know algebra. That's where the data leads. And it takes cults. It takes incredible willfulness and stubbornness and self-referential identity for cults to ignore the data and focus on doing what they've always done despite the data. And that's really what a cult is. Because if you're following the data day to day in all areas necessary to well-being, you don't have a lot of rigid rules and taboos, etc. You have a lot of growth, you have a lot of iteration, you have a lot of experimentation, you have a lot of communication, you have a lot of questions and awareness. But in a cult, this cannot be asked. This cannot be thought about. All that matters is who we are. And all that matters in deciding who we are is who we were. It's not what is the most intelligent, what is the most efficient way to create the most amount of sustainable human well-being for the least amount of energy, time, money, natural resources. It's all about this is who we are because that's who we are. And that's who we are, and that's why we do this. And we do this because that's who we are. It's a self-referential loop that boycotts any new data, any new information. And so when I talk about the experiences that I have in my own life and in the building of identity, my pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, I'm talking about probability fields that put enormous pressure on a growing infant, child, adolescent, and that produce statistically high yields of conforming identities to a given cult, to a given pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And just like the rings of a tree, if you cut a 100-year-old oak tree, you'll find 100 rings. And as the tree moves or moves in the light, etc., the rings are not exactly symmetrical. And the reason for that is the environment is not symmetrical. The wind comes stronger from the northeast. And so the tree grows differently. The tree had to grow differently because they had to put the biggest root to block the tree falling over against the main wind. So if the main wind comes from this direction, the biggest root has to grow out in this direction. And as the root becomes part of the formation of the trunk of the tree, then as it moves up, the tree bulges in that area. And so the entire tree is not fully circular. The entire tree has a distorted circle, but nevertheless, you will see rings in a tree. If the tree is 100 years old, you'll see 100 rings. And if the psyche is 100 years old, you'll see 100 rings, 100 shadows, 100 memories, 100 identities as one layer of identity, of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being grows on top of the others in pursuit of human need, of the fulfillment of human needs, which are the path to feeling sustainably better and avoiding feeling chronically worse. So, as I think of the earliest times in my identity, the sense somewhat before time, somewhat before words, one of the identities that there wasn't a lot of room for was of witnessing. And the witnessing, this particular part, this form of consciousness, as I experience it, seems to say to my parents, what are you so afraid of? Why do we have to avoid all feelings? Why do we have to avoid the truth? Because as any member of the family got near certain feelings or certain truths, my parents would exert the force of giants relative to an infant, a child, to dissuade the child, the infant, the adolescent from going into certain feelings, going into certain awarenesses, saying certain things, believing certain things, that these were taboo within the family system. And initially I didn't believe the lies of my parents, of the giants. But in physical environments where an infant is dependent on the giant, the law of mass, not the law of intelligence, is primary. The law of mass says that when a pinball, size of a centimeter, collides with a bowling ball, size of a foot, when they meet, moving in opposite directions at the same speed, the pinball goes flying. The bowling ball continues because whatever has the most momentum, the most mass, absorbs the energy of that which is smaller and then continues. And in this way, that which is bigger dominates and changes that which is smaller more than that which is smaller changes that which is bigger. And this is particularly the case when you have parentally illiterate parents who do not understand trauma and PTSD, who are not in touch with their own feelings, because it takes empathy and competence and adult love for a child to sincerely attune to a child. The child has no choice but to attune to a parent who will not attune to them. And so this is the law of mass colliding with the law of empathy. And it's important to understand that every child, every infant coming into our world is confronted with this law of mass. Now, this part of me that didn't fully believe and didn't understand why feelings were so dangerous to both of my parents was kind of buried. And I would say a lot of the burying came with shock. And the shock led to a certain amount of numbness, and also a lot of fear. And so one of the things that happens when any child is born into a situation is there's a movement to form a secure attachment. And a secure attachment is a relationship where there is consistent, regulated presence on all dimensions. Physical, emotional, mental, tonal, where there is a movement. Now, if you lean into a partner, to a parent, and they lean back, you have a secure attachment. If you pull away and they give you space, you have a secure, safe attachment. But if you lean in emotionally and they pull away because they're afraid of emotions, then there's no one to hold container. The search for something leads to a crash. You keep looking because we are mental, emotional, physical beings. We exist on all three dimensions, and the inner states of thinking and feeling are more of the identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. They're more of the identity than the outer, than the physical. You have thinking, feeling, and doing. Thinking, feeling are inner. Outer is doing. And in order to be sane, in order to become conscious, and in order to become sane and integrated, one has to form relationships on all three dimensions, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Now, this is why the ecological perspective is so important. Why is it that my parents are frightened of their feelings? Because it has nothing to do with them. Well, if we take my father and his father, a man who's returned from the Second World War and told that to be a man, he must be in control, but who feels helpless and out of control, that to be a man, he must be stoic, but who feels terrified and emotional, and who is taught that if he's not a man, he is somehow to be shamed and treated with contempt in a reptilian environment that preys upon weakness with volleys, with weapons of humiliation, of shame, of ostracization, of contempt, and various forms of punishment and abuse. If you've ever watched the sheer cruelty and hostility of a homophobic group of men attacking and beating up an effeminate homosexual, you understand that what's happening on the outside there is also happening on the inside of every one of those men. That the person who wants to kill the effeminate homosexual is the person who has successfully already killed with contempt and hatred the inner feminine, and out of that, the potential for bisexuality. Because if there's nothing there to relate to, if you just say, man, I don't get it. I don't feel any of that in me. There's no passion to have any relationship with it at all. In order to hate something and want to kill it, it has to arouse your passion. And in order for it to arouse your passion, you've got to be able to relate to it. And in order for you to relate to it on the outside, you've got to already have a relationship with it on the inside. Otherwise, there's no reaction. Because the reaction on the outside is a response to the action already taken on the inside. as the cult's internalized pressure and messages coerce the individual into exterminating parts of their own psyche that the cult threatens to exterminate for them if they don't cooperate. You have the forced haircutting of a young man who doesn't want to cut their hair. Do you want to do it, or do I have to do it for you? It's going to hurt more. Do you want to walk over here, or do I have to come over and pull your ear and cause you excruciating pain? You're going to come over here one way or another. I am the authority. I am the one with superior mass. You have to secure my goodwill, my cooperation, or you get no food, you get no money, you get no schooling. You don't live. You must obey me. I am the rep of the cult. And you will cut your hair. You will walk over here. You will go to school. I do not want to hear any of your feelings, any of your preferences, any of your uniqueness, any of your desire. You are going to fit into the space provided by the cult for you, or I am going to kill you in the process of trying. And this may be framed as love, which is a veil to mask the fear, the hostility, the hatred, the helplessness of a cult that wants to hang on to its pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, which it can't do without the cooperation of the majority. A cult is defined by the patterns a majority of its people hold. If a majority of people say, you know what, potatoes, pizza, Coke makes you fat. I'm not highly creative after that. I'm just going to eat broccolini and kale. What's the problem? Well, the problem is enormous. It is a challenge to the identity of the cult. The cult will try shaming you, try ostracizing you, gossiping about you, setting you up to fail, not promoting you, because you're a divergence from the status quo. And if people keep diverging, there will be no status quo. And if there's no status quo, we won't know what to expect. If we don't know what to expect, we won't know how to prepare. If we don't know how to prepare, it's just going to take more thought, more time, more energy. We've got to have a status quo, and so you have got to fit into this hole. Now, we can get you into this hole the easy way or the hard way. What's the easy way? You sell out your inner warrioress, your inner warrior. You sell out your uniqueness. You sell out your truth, your authenticity. And you do the prison guards' work for them. You walk yourself into prison. You turn the key and you make it easy. Don't worry about guarding me. I know there's a little crack in the prison. I could get out over here, but I'm not going to try. Go have a nap. You make it easy for the status quo. Or you do it the hard way. How many people have to gang up on one 6-year-old before they get it? That they can't win. That even if they run away, someone will return them to the abuser. Come over or I'm going to pull your ear. I'm going to shout at you. I'm not going to give you any dinner. I'm going to do this. What do I have to hurl with the weight of a giant? Applying the law of superior mass at a child before they will agree to do what they are told to do because I said so, because that's what we do. Now your vitamin C might go up, your fat levels might go down, the cult may lose some of its obesity if people switched from potatoes, pizza, and Coke to asparagus, kale, and broccolini with a bit of whole grain rice or whatever it is. We could have a reduction in obesity, but that's not the goal of a cult. The goal of a cult is to ensure normalcy and conformity, and of course the goal of advertisers is to define the norm. Coke and Pepsi want to say that we are the cult. Don't you understand? If you stop drinking sugar, you won't be a part of the cult. To be a part of the cult, be like us. Buy Coke and Pepsi. Buy 7-Up. Buy something that we sell. And our job is to spend hundreds of millions of dollars over time to connect in your brain, to associate our product with the status quo, with the cult. Now, the shock, being hit, I remember being hit by my grandfather, and typically grandparents treat parents, typically grandparents treat grandchildren much more gently than they treated their own children. There's a couple of reasons for it. One is there's no eternity. You know, when you're a parent with a 5-year-old, you feel like, oh my gosh, I have no rest for the next 10 years, 12 years, oh my goodness, 13 years. I am stuck having to ram this unique human being into this box for the next 13 years, and you feel overwhelmed with the burden that the cult has assigned to you. Because the cult will judge the parent, will tisk at the parent, will arrest the parent if their child doesn't fit into the box. And so the parents have a tremendous incentive to try and get their children to get in there in whatever way possible. But this is, of course, a nightmare for the healthier and more unique parts of the child, because just like the diet and health of a nation might improve with broccolini and asparagus over pizza, potatoes, and Coke, the cult might benefit from the creativity, the spontaneity of the child's spontaneous activity diet instead of the route, memorization, the uniform, the routine of the cult. You're going to watch this TV show here, you're going to eat this food, you're going to go and do this room, you're going to do this, and you're going to do that. The diet of exploration, of spontaneity, of one-on-one mentorships, of engaging in the community, has measurable scientific benefits relative to the cult dogma. But it's not what we do in this cult. And so there's definitely, starting around 3-4 years old, there starts to be kind of this part in me that's trying to get out of the prison, to avoid the shackle, and also still bond in a secure, emotional way with my parents. However, this part that's seeking a secure emotional bond with both parents is deflected in a variety of ways. One of them is physical violence. You try and get too emotional with us, we'll hit you, we'll beat you, we'll whip you with a belt, we'll pull your ear, we'll pull your hair. So one is physical violence. And so the drive is towards secure emotional attachment. The parent is moving away. If I follow, then there can also be superior mass and physical violence. So physical violence and shock and shame and fear and hurt. And of course, when you're in trauma, and that's what an infant and a child is when a giant uses physical force in a dynamic of superior mass, there is no secure emotional relationship there. But there's a stronger need because no one's available. Now, my parents had moved into the, quote, wilderness, miles away from anyone, in a very rural upstate New York, which is nothing like the city. So there were miles between our house and the nearest neighbor. And so by ostracizing the children from all cultural influences, under the guise of benefiting the children, keeping them the toxicity of the general culture away, there was no one to have a safe, emotional, attached relationship with. And so we had the rebuff of violence. Now, in that place of fear and loneliness and trauma and shock, my mother laughs in this terrain. And so one has to imagine that there's a part of her that feels very small and helpless and scared and unable to connect with anyone. And that part is abandoned or pushed away by her cult and her culture growing up, but that in some way it brings my mother pleasure, not to connect and respond, but to watch and participate in this terror and helplessness of her infant children. And this is read on my 3-year-old face by her laughing and her enjoyment going up as I feel disoriented, shocked, frightened, lonely, and small. She feels more expansive and enjoys herself more. In other words, if I want to please mother, I need to hurt and be betrayed and allow her to hurt and abandon me. Now, another way that this is, so she's kind of attacking with that laughter. And what being laughed at, because this wasn't being laughed with, I'm in terror. Being laughed at is a message of dissociation. And of course, it's why a parent who is traumatically and emotionally illiterate will not bond emotionally with their parent. They don't want to associate with their own pain, and they don't want to associate with the pain of their child. And so there's a sense of, well, laughter is one way to laugh at, to project and transfer one's own hurt and valuelessness, one's own pain, onto the child. And, obviously it's very painful for the child to have no one, to be traumatized by the parent, to have no secure emotional attachment. Another thing my father would do would be to fall asleep, because probably the most bonded moment that I can remember in childhood was for Michael to read us stories. And because this was such a desirable experience, there was also a little bit of bribery, etc. And, you have to wonder, when a parent needs their child to feel valuable and feel important, that's not saying much about the child. What it's saying a lot about is the cult that the parent resides in. Because for a parent, for Michael, to need to feel important from his children means that he didn't get to feel important from his wife. Now, why? Because she's emotionally unavailable. Because she's committed to not feeling. And how can you make someone feel significant if you tune them out? So Sherilyn was a master in the art of oblivion. She could listen to you and say, what, oh, interesting. And you say, well, what was I talking about? She said, oh, what were you saying? Say it again. That's oblivion. To not listen to someone, to tune them out, and then to pretend to listen to them so that you can tune them out more effectively for longer, is two levels of betrayal. The first is tuning them out, meaning you're so unimportant, you're the last person I want to listen to. And then the second level is, oh, I fully understand it, because I don't want to make the effort to actually be present and understand. I just want to pretend so that I don't have to make the effort. I'm going to lie to you. You have two levels of betrayal. And then when you will not emotionally respond to nuance and details, it says that those nuance and details don't matter. And so Michael can't get the feeling of significance from his wife. Now, why is he so needing this feeling of significance? Could it have anything to do with the fact that his mother valued alcohol more than him or his well-being? Could it have anything to do with the fact that his father hit, shamed, and abused him? If him as a child and his presence as a child stimulated the traumatic memories and feelings that he, as a traumatically illiterate veteran, didn't know how to deal with, but was committed not to feel. Could it have anything to do with that? Of course. Meaning, and could it have anything to do with the fact that Michael grew up in a cult that valued him constantly for his ideas and never even noticed what his feelings were, and never honored him and asked about those feelings? Of course it could. So Michael is induced into a feeling of chronic and sustained smallness and insignificance, first by his parents, then by his teachers, then by his peers, then by various women, then by my mother. And so he wants to get this feeling of importance from the children. And so what he does is he effectively grasps that storytelling is the most desired interaction with him. Then he dangles it as to get little hits of importance. Does anyone want a story? Now, if the response isn't high enough, then Michael doesn't get the bribe that he's looking for with the story. The bribe is, you've got to make me important and feel important. So he doesn't get that. If he says, do you want a story? And we say, yeah, let's have a story. Or we're bored or irritated with him for tormenting us in some way. And so we are sulking. So if he torments us into sulking, and he says, do you want a story? Maybe because he feels guilty tormenting us or whatever it is. Then if the response is, yeah, we'll take a story, Dad. See, that doesn't make him feel like he's the most important person in the world. So he needs to feel that way because no one else in his cult leads to him feeling that way. So he needs to get this out of his kid in some way. So he he dangles the story and says, oh, well, you don't sound very interested. Maybe we'll skip the story tonight. And this will elicit, since that's the most valuable moment, the clamor, no, let's have the story. So if that's not enough to make him feel like a man and important, and he'll say, really, maybe we should just skip the story tonight. So he'll bring it up to a fever pitch so that he can really bask in the fact that some person in his entire cult actually thinks he's important. So then he gets the stroke, and so he'll start reading. But, of course, we're interested in the story, not trying to make Dad feel important. So we're listening to the story, and it's not making him feel terribly important. So he starts yawning and falling asleep. And so he'll play and milk out attention. Come on, Dad, read another sentence. Oh, I'm so tired. I mean, since when are 30-year-old men falling to sleep before kids are at night? I mean, it's ridiculous. Because, of course, he'd wake up immediately after, begging out of the story or pretending to fall asleep or whatever. And, he'd get up and do something that, that he wanted. So there was this milking process. Now, if you don't have an emotional secure attachment with either parent, if your emotions are constantly attacked, if you are attacked emotionally for triggering the feelings in your parents, one of the things that, emerged is, so we have shock, pain, depression, hurt, loneliness, numbness. So that's there. But then that's not giving mom and dad the comfort they want. So then there's a synthetic identity, which I would say is the adaptive. See, the hurt and pain, etc., leads to punishment, leads to contempt, because those are authentic, real feelings that children feel when they're constantly stymied, messed with. For example, my father would drag me around in a sack. I mean, fun entertainment for every 5-year-old, right? Would you like to get into this sack? Well, finally, Dad's interested in something, right? He's taking you out into the wilderness. And so, what does it take to get Dad to want to, engage? Oh, get in this sack. Well, Dad wants to drag you up and down the stairs around in a sack. And this is entertaining, apparently, for him. But he doesn't want authentic feelings. He is enraged with a child actually focusing on themselves. And so this shock, pain, depression, hurt, loneliness naturally leads to a healthy anger. You fucking bastard, da da da. Don't you talk to your father like this, right? So this identity naturally and authentically leads to some anger, some aggression. But that is met with a counterattack of shame and rage and this and that, the other, as if the child is bad for having feelings for being abused. Don't you talk to your parents like this, that, the other. So that's not okay. So then comes, I would say, the first really adaptive persona. Because when the truth, it's like you're an accountant and you're given 4, and then you're given another 4, and you're asked, what's the number? You say 8. And the person hiring you to do your accounting says, 8? Oh no! I don't want to hear 8. Please don't tell me it's an 8. I'm going to fire you if I don't know what I'm going to do. My world's going to come again. Da, 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 da. Please don't make it an 8. I mean, yes, I told you 4, and then there's another 4, but 8. Oh, my goodness. You're breaking my heart. It's like, please don't tell me it's an 8. Please. What is it? What is it? Oh, no, it's an 8. After this goes on with, enough melodrama, ear-pulling beatings, and this and the other. I mean, we can't do this to our accountants, and, a mature accountant would just tell you to go fuck yourself. But what does a 2-year-old do? A 5-year-old do? 4 plus 4 equals 8, but I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. And of course, this is a common refrain in parentally illiterate cultures where parents do not receive a single sound hour of competent parenting. They don't want to hear that it's an 8. It is an 8, but they do not want to deal with reality. In other words, they're insane. They've dissociated from the areas of reality that upset their own parents. And they never got that back because their parents never had the decency to acknowledge their insanity and the anomaly. They are insane. So the accountant says 8 and gets fired. The accountant goes and works for another company and says, yeah, 4 and 4 still equals 8, and gets fired. Blacklisted. Don't hire that accountant. They'll tell you all kinds of horrible numbers that you do not want to hear if you're a business owner. Finally, the accountant gets wise and says, tries first. Is 4 and 4 6? Are you happy about this? It's getting better. 4 and 4 is 4. 4 and 4 is 3. Oh, 4 plus 4 is negative 200. And now I'm the best accountant in the world? That's what I wanted to hear, negative 200. That means I get a bonus. That means this. That means this. We can just carry on without thinking. We can do what we've always done and expect different results. If only we can get the accountant to lie. And of course, every relationship is an accountant. We have impact. And the impact shows up mentally, emotionally, financially, culturally, and physically in the partner around us. We hit someone. For the most part, it doesn't produce joy and delight. But if we hit someone and then refuse to deal with the actual impact of hitting someone, and they're in a dependent relationship, now we can dictate what's called a synthetic personality. So in this synthetic part, this starts to develop about age 5. I'm trying to be the person, the boy, that mom and dad are interested in having as a son, despite the fact that that has nothing to do with the feelings produced by being their son. The feelings produced by being their son, loneliness, anger, resentment, envy, hurt, depression, numbness, shock, anger. These feelings of being their son are not welcome. They're just the feelings that anyone would have being put into isolation with two grown-ups who are not adults, who need their children psychologically and who are demanding that their children dissociate from their own feelings so that the parent, the giant, can feel more comfortable treating the child in the way that they want to treat the child, independent of how that works for the child. And then because they don't want to feel guilty by dominating the shit out of a 5-year-old, they need to spin all kinds of New Age, often hypocrisy and nonsense, but spins as to how this is all for your good. You don't want anything to do with that horrible American cult out there. We're better than that. And so this, we've isolated you, and you're lucky, and that's because we love you, not because we want a private environment to torment a 5-year-old without any outside influences and make sure that they have no secure attachment anywhere else. No. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with transferring all our loneliness and paranoia and aggression and anger and insanity on this child. No, we're doing this to protect you from that horrible world out there that we're superior to. And so the deflection, laughter in pain, dissociation, hostility, rage, violence, threats of violence, threats of abandonment. When you have no secure emotional attachment with a single adult, threats of abandonment are the most horrible things imaginable because you've been traumatized into a dissociative abyss, into complex PTSD. And it's the last place you want to leave a child that's trying to connect with the world. It's trying to connect with themselves. But if you do that to a child, if you set it up in that way, then they're going to be terrified of being left alone in the hell that you've induced in their body and in their psyche. And so that's exactly what Michael and Sherilyn did, was they threatened to leave. I remember being put in the dryer. I think that was with Sherilyn. And anyway, something was very upsetting to her. And so she said she was leaving and never coming back. So that's one threat to a 5-year-old. Or let's go out in the forest, and then the parents will hide. And so innocent and fun. As the child feels lost and alone and unable to take care of themselves, a reality. Parents wait until the child is helplessly in tears. And that's the moment they laugh. Here we are, enjoying your misery the entire time. Here we are, instilling fear and terror into someone who has nowhere else to turn. Here we are, being sadistically cruel to a helpless infant, a helpless child, as a way of venting our frustration. You see, and you could say, oh, what evil, horrible parents. Where are they going to learn parental literacy? Surrounded by hypocrites and the New Age thing that don't want to deal with their shadow, their own cruelty. In a cult that doesn't want to spend a single hour teaching them how to be parents, where are they going to learn to empathize when no one taught them to empathize with their own inner child, let alone when they were a child? Where are they going to learn that? And there's plenty of people in the business of selling quick fixes, New Age fixes that are going to tell them, you bought my book, you bought my course, you are wonderful parents. You did this, you're above average, you did this. And so when why are you going to buy something if you're an idiot for buying it? So the only way you can buy something is if people tell you how wonderful you are if you buy it. Well, they bought a lot of things. And so they knew how wonderful they were as parents to do all of this stuff. So the anger, the hurt, the shock, the loneliness, the dissociation, not being able to connect emotionally with either parent, first of all, led to a lot of terror, a lot of loneliness, a lot of frustration, a lot of envy that I couldn't express this aggression directly. And so rather than directing it towards the abuser and the giant and then be punished for it, I redirected some of it towards my sister, who was 2 years younger than me. And one of my earliest memories is of my father watching me torment my sister. I would make my sister laugh, then I would make her cry, then I would make her laugh, then I would make her cry, and so I was, in a sense, doing what my father would do to us, which was get validation of his importance by having emotional impact on us. Positive, negative, it didn't matter, it made him feel important because we were having tremendously intense feelings about his behavior, so he must be important. So I was doing that with my sister, and I was like 4 years old. And I glance up and I look and I realize I'm here, but there's a me here. That's one of my first memories of me. Earlier memories are the oven blowing up in my mother's face, being chased by our dog, being afraid of being hit, being told how, the road is too fast and not to go near the road and various things like that. Those were kind of traumatic memories. But this one, I wake up and I'm making my sister laugh and cry in alternate movements. And I guess I'm trying to have a secure emotional relationship with my sister consistent with the sadistic love dynamic with my parents. And because my mother compensated for being emotionally unavailable by being overly sensual in a way that has a very, to me it feels like being the lover of a 17-year-old. That's the sensual vibe. If I was to describe an emotional age to my mother in her sensuality towards me, I would say this is a 17-year-old teenager who is curious and interested about sex and sensuality and is experimenting with me. That would be my perception of that energy dynamic. Of course, as a child, I just know that physically, like, she'll tickle me and I'll ask her to stop and she won't, because she's enjoying getting an effect out of my body that's beyond enjoyable or comfortable for me. She's not available emotionally, but she's available in a somewhat smothering physicality with sensual/sexual overtones. So, and not an empathy or an awareness of what it's like to be young. And so that worked with Sherilyn. With Michael, it was more, I need to make space for his grandiosity through thought. So Sherilyn will be available through body, but not through heart or mind. Michael will be available through mind, but not through heart. And primarily physically, it's, the dominant memories are, having my ear pulled or being hit or being chased, that kind of dynamic. So there's a lot of anger there, which cannot be talked about. It has to be acted out. And I felt a little bit ashamed, and kind of, it didn't feel quite right to be waking up and noticing that I'm making my sister cry and feeling curious about that. So I'm already numb to a certain extent where I can pass on the sociopathic message of the family at 4 years old. And Michael, I realize, is watching me. He's at a 45-degree angle, and it seems like he's been watching me for some time. I first feel ashamed. But then I recognize my father is actually allowing himself to bond emotionally with me, because he's seeing in me his own need to torment and make people happy, torment them and make them happy, back and forth. And so I realized that if I give this pattern of tormenting and making my sister happy up, he will no longer bond with me. This is the only emotional connection that we share, is a sense of shame from the shadows. So he's not protecting my sister, and he certainly wasn't protecting me. But he is extending empathy through shared shame by identifying with my need to torment my sister, which he relates to because he needs to do that to us and to Sherilyn, my mother. And so that's my one emotional bond with my father. And as I move into kind of boyhood and, 6, 7-year-old, I learned that, I've got to dissociate from shock, pain, depression, hurt, loneliness, numb, anger, hostility, any of that. Because that escalates the violence. Like if I express that when Michael's trying to punish me, then he'll shake me to communicate that none of that is okay. That what I need to do is to be punished and respond to the punishment in the way he wants me to respond to the punishment, which is to get that his way is the right way and his way is the best way, and that he's the boss and I have to listen to him, etc. And then he'll calm down. And so I sublimated and suppressed a lot of this initial, anger, fear, hurt identity, because there was no safe place for it. And then I went into the synthetic identity, which was to be a little bit of the toy boy for my mother, because as long as I wasn't having real feelings, she was pretty comfortable. And as long as I wasn't arguing or interrupting or in any way suggesting there could be a flaw in any of my father's ideas, then he was able to be grandiose and in his head, which was his safe place. My mother wanted to be off in fantasy land and be playfully sensual like a child. And my father wanted to be off in his head with no feelings and feel very important, to antidote the incredibly small, hurt, lonely little boy that was traumatized in him, that no one in the cult would do anything about, and no one taught him to do anything about. In fact, they taught him that to go see a therapist meant there was something wrong with you and it would be shameful that you needed help. Because to receive is feminine, and in a chauvinistic cult, if you need something and receive it, you are more feminine, and thus you are more weak, and you are to be disparaged relative to if you don't need help and are more masculine and are the giver, the provider. That's noble and important. And so when you do need help, because you feel incredibly traumatized and small, but to ask for help immediately results in you being categorically defined as less than and small, then if you need help and ask for help, before you can even get the help, you are made to feel more small by the chauvinism innate in the cult that says that if you need something, you are less valuable than if you don't need something. To which the obvious synthetic response of a young boy growing up in a chauvinistic cult is to say, I don't need anyone, which is a common refrain in the United States. You have traumatized, lonely, psychologically illiterate, self-destructive individuals, many with thoughts of suicide, feel incredibly lonely and terrified and small. And what they're saying is, I don't need anyone, which is the exact opposite of the truth. Why are they lying? Because they get a boost within the chauvinism of the cult for lying and pretending that they don't need anyone, when they desperately, desperately do need someone. There you have it. So we'll take a break and continue to look at the archaeology of identity in just a little bit. Now, if I look at this synthetic, or it's often called an adaptive personality, what this is made up of, it's made up of, I guess, some of my mother's fantasy about who I was, because when you need to have a sense of self, you need to learn regulation, how to bounce off of an environment, mentally, emotionally, and physically. So if my mother disappears every time I try to bounce off from her, then I don't get any sense of regulation. It's like I throw the ball, she dodges, and the ball never comes back. And so I don't get the completion of the feedback loop. And so the way that I found to get completion of the feedback loop with my mother was to move into character with some of her fantasy. So that meant figuring out what she was fantasizing about, and then how to become one of those characters so that I was real in her world. And then I could learn regulation because now I exist in my mother's fantasy. Well, this is, of course, incredibly lonely and sad because it means that the authentic feelings and self doesn't exist in my mother's world, and I have to dissociate from myself in order to exist in my mother's fantasy. Now, the same was true to a certain extent in Michael's world. His was a lot more verbal. Hers was more playful and sensual. But there's a similar dynamic of joining him in his world of ideas and comments. And I can kind of remember around that time going for walks along the trail. And basically, a lot of it consists of two things with my father. One is listening to him in the stance of, aren't you the great wizard of ideas? The other was being a bit silly and entertaining him in a way that would not trigger any feelings. So becoming his entertain, I became somewhat hyperactive in some ways to distract from my own feelings. And so this is moving into anxious entertaining and performing in order to avoid being hit, avoid being hurt, avoid being attacked, avoid being feared. Because one of the things that kind of, I guess, took place in between the synthetic identity, we'll call it up here, is rage, fear, serious. So there were some parts of me, some parts of my expression to which my parents responded with rage, with fear, very seriously, with the message that this is your fault. And this was too big to carry as a 4 or 5-year-old. I wonder if it was some of this pain, depression, anger, etc. being directed towards my sister. I just know that around that time, I got a very clear message that who you are authentically with your feelings is deeply upsetting, deeply bad, must be wiped out, and so this, I think, leads directly to an internalization of a layer of identity, a layer of growth in which I feel evil, unlovable, bad. In other words, as my parents are destructive, as my parents are incapable of loving, as my parents are incapable of being adults, they're asking their child to do things that they cannot do. They're asking their child to be more responsible than they are. And this extends, by the way, into the, quote, curative environment. My father took me to a psychologist named Barbara Kennefic in upstate New York. And Kennefic did a very nuanced report of what she observed in me. And these were largely accurate observations. I read the report recently and I thought, okay, this woman actually is taking the time to see things that certainly my parents are not taking the time to see. And so you could say that Kennefic saw, at that point, I think maybe it was an 8-year-old child or 9-year-old child. But what's interesting with what she did is she did not infer the environment of that child from the observation of the child. It's like she saw the round rock in the river, but did not infer that this rock has been tumbled and washed for thousands of years of river water, and that's why an angular rock has become rounded. She left it with the descriptions, which a lot of diagnosis, if you look at psychological and other, diagnosis, they're literally just Latin descriptions of English. So if someone is compulsive in a lot of their activity, you'll find a doctor diagnosing them with obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, that's not even Latin, but, so you're basically saying, I am doing things compulsively. That's obvious. I knew that. You knew this. I paid you $300 or whatever. And you just find an official way of saying the exact same thing? You have an obsessive compulsive disorder? Well, if I didn't know that, I wouldn't have hired you. But what's missing is the ecological awareness. Because you see, it's leaving it at the child. It's like saying a rock has been polished over thousands of years of river water and tumbling. And a person looks at the rock carefully and says, you are a round rock. But it's not leading to broader vision, and more importantly, it's not implicating the client who's paying the bill, which is the parent. Because a much more useful thing to say in a psychological report is you show the kinds of symptoms that children who have been hit a lot show. Do you hit your child a lot? In other words, you divert the attention from the child, who is not supposed to be fixing and responding, to the consequences of occult design created by grown-ups. The grown-ups are supposed to be learning to be adults which means they take responsibility, own that they have the ability to respond, and become adults by showing the willingness to respond. If nothing else, by beginning by learning how much they don't know as parents, and then passing that on to the child, rather than shaming the child for being an innately bad person. Telling the child, you know what? We've learned that we don't know anything about parenting because my parents weren't very good parents, and neither were mine, and we never took any courses. And culturally speaking, we're not that great at parents. Now, how do we know we're not that great at parenting? Our cult is littered with violence, incest, addiction, alcoholism, trauma, PTSD, emotional illiteracy, and children and parents that are in families where the two parents don't talk to each other, the two parents don't talk to themselves, and the two parents do not talk with their children, and the children don't talk to either the parents and don't talk to themselves and don't talk to their peers. Either they put on a performance to mask not knowing what every member in the default cult doesn't know. Because if you are raised by emotionally illiterate grown-ups in a cult without a single hour of formal emotional training, why on earth would you know anything about psychology or feelings? But if you then shame children for not knowing, rather than appreciate their curiosity, by shaming femininity, which includes a derogatory view of the unknown, which is why, as a chauvinist, I knew that. Why do chauvinists lie and pretend they know so much? And why do they have to point it out so often? I knew that already. Why is the chauvinist so anxious that everyone knows that they already knew that? Because to know something is masculine, whether you're a man or a woman, and to not know something, to be open to mystery, is feminine. And in a chauvinistic cult, that is to admit a deficit. Knowledge is more valuable in a chauvinistic paradigm than not knowing. Now, the problem is, of course, that 99.999% of all reality there is to know is unknown. And so there's a devaluing of the vast majority of the ecology that we not only don't know, but we don't know that we don't know. But if we pretend that we know all of that, or pretend that anything we don't know isn't worth knowing, we're pretending that 99.9% of all that isn't worth knowing, or that we already know it, which either way we're stuck in cult-initiated blindness.